The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestone courtyard of Buckingham Palace as Sergeant James Mitchell adjusted his red tunic for the final time before taking his post. At 28 years old, he had served as one of the Queen's Guard for 6 years, a position he held with immense pride and unwavering dedication. The black bearskin hat sat perfectly on his head, and his polished boots reflected the early light like mirrors. James came from a military family. His father had served in the Royal Navy, his grandfather in the Army during World War II. When James was just 8 years old, his father had brought him to watch the changing of the guard ceremony. Standing in the crowd, wide-eyed and mesmerized by the precision and dignity of the guards, young James had whispered to his father, "I want to do that someday." His father had smiled and ruffled his hair, saying, "Then you'll need to earn it, son. Nothing worth doing comes easy." Those words had shaped James's entire life. He had excelled in school, joined the local cadet program at 14, and enlisted in the British Army the day after his 18th birthday. Years of rigorous training, discipline, and service had led him to this moment, standing guard at one of the most important buildings in the United Kingdom. The tourists began arriving early, as they always did. James stood perfectly still at his post near the palace gates, his rifle held in the traditional position, his eyes focused straight ahead. He had learned long ago to tune out the constant chatter, the camera clicks, and the occasional attempts by visitors to make him move or react. It was all part of the job. Around mid-morning, a luxury tour bus pulled up to the designated area. James noticed it from the corner of his eye, sleek, expensive, with tinted windows and chrome details that gleamed in the sunlight. A small group of well-dressed tourists emerged, clearly wealthy based on their designer clothes, expensive jewelry, and the confident way they carried themselves. Among them was a man who immediately stood out, and not in a good way. Victor Pemberton III, heir to a massive American real estate fortune, stepped off the bus with the air of someone who believed the world existed for his entertainment. At 45, he was used to getting whatever he wanted, whenever he wanted it. His Armani suit probably cost more than most people made in 3 months, and the Rolex on his wrist could have funded a small charity for a year. Victor had never been told no in any meaningful way. Born into wealth, educated at the finest schools money could buy, he had grown up believing that everything and everyone had a price. He treated service workers like furniture, spoke down to anyone he considered beneath his social status, and had never faced real consequences for his behavior. "Look at this place," Victor announced loudly to his companions, gesturing broadly at the palace. "All this pomp and ceremony for what? A bunch of people in funny hats standing around doing nothing. In America, we'd turn this into a proper business, maybe a hotel or casino." His wife, Margaret, a thin woman who had learned long ago to simply agree with whatever Victor said, nodded nervously. "Yes, dear," she murmured, though her eyes showed embarrassment at her husband's loud voice carrying across the courtyard. Their teenage daughter Sarah rolled her eyes and continued texting on her phone. She had stopped trying to correct her father's behavior years ago. It was easier to pretend she didn't know him when he acted like this in public. The tour guide, a pleasant British woman named Emma who had been leading palace tours for 15 years, tried to maintain her professional demeanor. "The Queen's Guard," she explained to the group, "represents centuries of British military tradition. These soldiers have served in active combat zones around the world. They're not performers or actors. They're real military personnel carrying out an important ceremonial duty." Victor laughed dismissively. "Ceremonial duty? You mean standing around looking pretty for tourists like us? I bet I could do that job. How hard could it be to stand still and look serious?" Emma's smile became slightly strained. "Actually, sir, becoming a Queen's Guard requires extensive military training and service. These men have earned their positions through—" "Through what?" Victor interrupted. "Standing in line longer than the next guy? Please, In the real world, we call that being unemployed. James heard every word. He had developed excellent peripheral hearing during his years of service, a skill that helped him stay aware of his surroundings while maintaining his rigid posture. He had heard insults before. Tourists often made jokes or comments, thinking the guards couldn't hear or wouldn't react. Most of the time, the comments were harmless, born of curiosity or nervousness rather than malice. But something in Victor's tone was different. It wasn't just ignorant. It was deliberately disrespectful, designed to belittle and demean. James felt his jaw tighten slightly, but he maintained his position. He thought of his training, his oath, his duty. He thought of his father's words about earning respect through service. The tour guide continued her explanation, moving the group closer to where James stood. "The uniforms you see are steeped in history," Emma said, trying to redirect the conversation. "The red tunic, the bearskin hat, these traditions date back hundreds of years. Each piece has significance and meaning." Victor pulled out his phone and started taking pictures, moving closer to James. "Hey, can you tell this guy to turn toward me? I want a better angle for my Instagram." "Sir," Emma said politely, "the guards are on active duty. They don't pose for photos or interact with tourists. It's part of their—" "Everything has a price," Victor said, reaching into his wallet. "How much to get him to smile for the camera? 20 pounds? 50? James remained motionless, but inside he felt a familiar burning sensation in his chest. It was the same feeling he had experienced during his 3 tours of duty in Afghanistan, when local warlords had tried to bribe him and his unit to look the other way during illegal activities. The difference was that here, at home, in front of his nation's most important building, he had expected better. Victor stepped even closer, now just a few feet from James. "Come on," he said, waving the money. "It's just a picture. Don't tell me you British are too uptight to make a few extra pounds." The other tourists in the group began to look uncomfortable. An elderly couple from Germany whispered to each other in their native language, clearly disapproving of the Americans' behavior. A family from Japan stood quietly to the side, their faces showing polite confusion at the scene unfolding before them. Emma tried once more to intervene. "Mr. Pemberton, please understand that the Queen's Guard take their duties very seriously. They represent the Crown, and—" "The Crown?" Victor laughed loudly. "You mean that old lady who lives in this oversized house? Look, I appreciate history as much as the next guy, but this is the 21st century. These guys are basically expensive lawn ornaments." That was when James made a decision that would change everything. Very slowly, almost imperceptibly, he shifted his gaze to look directly at Victor. It wasn't a violation of protocol. Guards were allowed to acknowledge threats or disturbances. And Victor Pemberton III, heir to millions, master of the universe in his own mind, suddenly found himself looking into the eyes of a man who had seen real combat, who had lost friends in foreign wars, who had dedicated his life to serving something greater than himself. The look lasted only a few seconds, but in that brief moment, Victor felt something he hadn't experienced in years: genuine discomfort. There was no anger in the guard's eyes, no hatred, but there was something far more unsettling: disappointment. It was the look of a man who had expected better from a fellow human being and found himself let down. Most people might have taken that look as a sign to step back, to reconsider their behavior, to perhaps show a bit of respect. But Victor Pemberton III was not most people. He had built his entire identity around the idea that he was superior to others, that his wealth and status made him untouchable. The guard's look didn't humble him. It enraged him. "Oh, so now you want to stare at me?" Victor said, his voice rising. "You think you're better than me because you play dress-up for tourists? I could buy this entire palace and turn it into a parking lot." The tour guide's face had gone pale. Other tourists began backing away, sensing that something was about to go very wrong. Margaret Pemberton tugged at her husband's sleeve, whispering, "Victor, please, let's just go back to the bus." But Victor was beyond reason now. In his mind, this uniformed nobody had dared to judge him, had dared to look at him with anything less than the deference he believed he deserved. Years of unchecked privilege, of never facing consequences, of believing that money made him untouchable, had built to this moment. "You know what?" Victor said, stepping even closer to James. "I think you need to learn some respect for your betters." What happened next would be captured by a dozen different cameras, uploaded to social media within minutes, and viewed by millions of people around the world within hours. It would spark international discussions about respect, privilege, and the true meaning of service. It would change the lives of everyone involved in ways none of them could have imagined. Victor Pemberton III, in a moment of supreme arrogance and spectacular misjudgment, gathered saliva in his mouth and spat directly into the face of Sergeant James Mitchell, Queen's Guard, veteran of 3 combat tours, and one of the most disciplined soldiers in the British Army. The glob of spit hit James just below his left eye and began to slowly slide down his cheek. For a moment, the entire courtyard fell silent. Even the pigeons seemed to stop cooing. The only sound was the distant traffic from the street beyond the palace gates. James felt the warm moisture on his face, felt it dripping toward his chin, but he didn't move. He couldn't move, not because he was frozen in shock, but because every fiber of his being, every moment of his training, every lesson about duty and honor and service told him that he was bigger than this moment. He was representing something greater than himself, something that couldn't be diminished by the actions of one ignorant, wealthy man. But as he stood there, spit sliding down his face, James made another decision. He began to smile. It wasn't a bitter smile or an angry smile. It was the smile of a man who knew exactly what was about to happen next, and who was going to enjoy every second of it. Because Victor Pemberton III, in his supreme arrogance, had just made the biggest mistake of his privileged life. He had chosen to humiliate a Queen's Guard in front of dozens of witnesses in one of the most secure locations in London, while committing what was technically an assault on a member of Her Majesty's forces. And James Mitchell, standing there with spit on his face and a slowly growing smile, knew that sometimes the best revenge was simply letting the universe handle things in its own way. The silence stretched on for another moment, and then everything began to happen very quickly indeed. The first person to react was Sarah Pemberton, Victor's 16-year-old daughter. She had been filming everything on her phone, initially planning to post a funny video about her father's antics, but when she saw the spit hit the guard's face, she gasped and nearly dropped her device. "Dad!" she whispered harshly, but Victor wasn't listening. He stood there with a satisfied smirk on his face, apparently believing he had just put this nobody in his place. In Victor's twisted worldview, he had just demonstrated his superiority over someone he viewed as beneath him. He turned to his wife with an expression that seemed to say, "See how easy it is to handle these people?" But Margaret Pemberton's face had gone white as a sheet. Unlike her husband, she possessed basic human decency and could recognize when something terrible had just happened. She had watched the guard's eyes during the entire encounter, had seen the dignity and restraint the man had shown, and now felt physically sick at what her husband had done. The tour guide, Emma, stood frozen for a moment, her professional training completely inadequate for this situation. In 15 years of leading tours, she had dealt with difficult tourists, rude comments, and inappropriate behavior, but never anything like this. She fumbled for her radio, knowing she needed to call for help but unsure exactly what protocol covered this situation. The other tourists in the group began backing away more quickly now, instinctively understanding that they were witnessing something that would have serious consequences. The elderly German couple looked absolutely horrified. The Japanese family huddled together, the parents shielding their children's eyes. Several other tourists who had been nearby stopped to stare, many pulling out their phones to record what was happening. James Mitchell continued to stand at attention, the spit still visible on his face. But his smile had faded into something far more serious. He was thinking quickly, processing the situation with the tactical mind of a combat veteran. He knew that every move he made from this moment forward would be scrutinized, analyzed, and judged. He also knew that help was already on the way, because what Victor Pemberton III didn't understand, in his ignorance about British security protocols, was that assaulting a Queen's Guard was not just an insult to one soldier. It was an assault on the Crown itself, and the Crown was very well protected indeed. The first sign that Victor's world was about to change dramatically came from the nearly invisible security cameras positioned throughout the palace grounds. These high-definition cameras had captured every moment of the encounter from multiple angles. Within seconds of the incident, alerts had been automatically triggered in the Central Security Office. Chief Inspector David Harrison was reviewing routine security reports when his computer screen lit up with urgent notifications. At 53, he had spent 30 years in law enforcement, the last 8 as head of security for this section of the royal estate. He had seen plenty of incidents involving difficult tourists, but when he watched the footage of Victor spitting on the guard, his expression hardened. "All units, Code 7 at Gate 3, he spoke into his radio with calm authority. "Assault on Queen's Guard. Multiple witnesses. Suspect is male, approximately 45, American accent, expensive civilian clothing. Approach with caution, but do not escalate unnecessarily." The response was immediate and overwhelming. Within 2 minutes, 6 plainclothes security officers had converged on the courtyard from different directions. They moved casually, looking like ordinary tourists or maintenance workers, but James recognized them immediately. He had worked with royal security countless times and knew these men and women were among the most highly trained protection specialists in the world. Victor, still basking in his perceived victory, finally became aware that something was changing around him. He noticed more people gathering, noticed the subtle shift in the atmosphere, but his arrogance prevented him from understanding what was actually happening. "Come on," he said to his family. "Let's go find something more interesting. This guy's obviously not going to do anything entertaining." He had taken exactly 3 steps toward the tour bus when a polite but firm voice spoke behind him. "Excuse me, sir. Could I have a word with you, please?" Victor turned to see a nondescript man in his 40s wearing a simple gray suit. The man's appearance was so ordinary that Victor's first instinct was to dismiss him entirely. "Sorry, I'm busy," Victor said dismissively. "Whatever you're selling, I'm not interested." "I'm not selling anything, sir." "I'm Detective Inspector Williams with the Metropolitan Police. I need to speak with you about an incident that just occurred." For the first time since stepping off the tour bus, Victor felt a flicker of uncertainty, but his lifetime of privilege kicked in immediately. "Police? Look, officer, if this is about that little joke I just played, you're wasting your time. I'm an American citizen, and I know my rights. Besides, nothing happened here except a bit of harmless fun." Detective Inspector Williams maintained his calm demeanor. He had dealt with wealthy, entitled suspects before, and knew that the best approach was patience and professionalism. "Sir, I'm afraid spitting on a member of Her Majesty's forces constitutes assault under British law. I need to ask you to come with me so we can sort this out properly." Victor's face flushed red. "Assault? Are you kidding me? I barely touched the guy. And what's he going to do about it anyway? Stand there and take it like he's been trained to do?" "Actually, sir," another voice interrupted, "he's going to do exactly what any British citizen would do. He's going to press charges." Victor spun around to see James Mitchell approaching, having been relieved of his post by another guard who had appeared seamlessly to take his place. James had used his sleeve to wipe his face clean, but his expression remained serious and determined. "You can't be serious," Victor said, his voice rising again. Over a little spit? Do you know who I am? Do you have any idea what kind of legal team I can afford? James stopped directly in front of Victor, close enough that the wealthy American could see the veteran's eyes clearly. When James spoke, his voice was quiet, but carried the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed in life-or-death situations. "My name is Sergeant James Mitchell," he said. "I've served 3 tours in Afghanistan, lost 2 friends to IEDs, and spent 6 years guarding this palace because I believe in duty, honor, and respect. You spat in my face because you think your money makes you better than me. You're about to learn that in Britain, we have a different opinion about that." For the first time in his adult life, Victor Pemberton III found himself looking into the eyes of someone who wasn't impressed by his wealth, wasn't intimidated by his threats, and wasn't going to be bought off or bullied into submission. The feeling was so foreign to him that he actually took a step backward. "Look," Victor said, his voice losing some of its confidence. "Maybe we can work something out. I'm sure there's been a misunderstanding. I'm willing to make a donation to whatever charity you support, and we can forget this whole thing happened." James shook his head slowly. "This isn't about money, Mr. Pemberton. This is about the fact that you thought you could humiliate a British soldier on British soil because you have more money than he does. You're wrong, and you're going to face the consequences of being wrong." Detective Inspector Williams stepped forward again. "Mr. Pemberton, you have the right to remain silent. You do not have to say anything, but it may harm your defense if you do not mention when questioned something which you later rely on in court. Anything you do say may be given in evidence." The formal caution hit Victor like a physical blow. Suddenly, the reality of his situation began to penetrate his wall of privilege. "You're actually arresting me for spitting on someone?" "For assault, sir," Williams corrected. "And yes, we are." The scene that followed would be replayed millions of times on social media over the next few days. Video footage from multiple angles showed Victor Pemberton III, heir to a real estate fortune, being handcuffed and led away from Buckingham Palace while tourists watched in stunned silence. His wife Margaret followed behind, tears streaming down her face, while their daughter Sarah continued filming everything with her phone. But the real story was just beginning. Because while Victor was being processed at the local police station, something extraordinary was happening in the digital world. The videos of his encounter with the Queen's Guard were spreading across the internet at lightning speed. Sarah's original video, posted to TikTok with the caption, "My dad being extra at Buckingham Palace," had already garnered 50,000 views before Victor was even in the police car. But it was the videos taken by other tourists that really captured the public's imagination. A German tourist named Klaus Miller had filmed the entire encounter from start to finish. His video, posted to YouTube within an hour, showed Victor's increasingly aggressive behavior the moment he spat on the guard, and James Mitchell's dignified response. Klaus had titled the video, "Rich American Tourist Attacks British Guard, Instant Karma." Within 2 hours, the video had 1 million views. By evening, it had 10 million. By the next morning, major news outlets around the world were covering the story. The headlines were brutal. "Wealthy tourist learns money can't buy respect." "American millionaire arrested after spitting on Queen's Guard." "When privilege meets reality." The fall of Victor Pemberton III. But it wasn't just the news media that was interested in the story. Social media users began digging into Victor's background, and what they found painted a picture of a man who had spent his entire life believing that wealth exempted him from basic human decency. Stories emerged of Victor's treatment of service workers at his hotels and restaurants. Former employees came forward with accounts of his verbal abuse, his refusal to pay overtime, and his habit of firing people for minor infractions. A waitress in New York shared a story about Victor screaming at her until she cried because his steak was medium instead of medium rare. Meanwhile, people began researching James Mitchell's background as well. But what they found created a completely different narrative. Military records showed his distinguished service record, his commendations for bravery under fire, and his volunteer work with veterans' charities. Fellow soldiers came forward to speak about his character, his dedication, and his quiet heroism. Back at the police station, Victor was learning that British law enforcement wasn't particularly impressed by his American wealth either. The custody sergeant, a no-nonsense woman named Patricia Stevens, who had dealt with plenty of entitled suspects over her 25-year career, processed his paperwork with professional efficiency. "I want to call my lawyer," Victor demanded for the 5th time in 10 minutes. "I want to call the American embassy. I want to speak to whoever's in charge here." "You'll get your phone call, sir," Sergeant Stevens replied calmly. "But I should mention that we've already been in contact with the embassy. They're aware of your situation and have expressed their hope that this matter will be handled according to British law, just like any other case." Victor's face went pale. "What do you mean, just like any other case?" "I'm an American citizen. Doesn't that count for something?" "It counts for the fact that you'll be treated fairly and according to the law," Stevens said, "same as everyone else." For Victor, those words, "same as everyone else," were perhaps the most terrifying thing anyone had ever said to him. He had spent 45 years believing he was special, different, above the ordinary rules that governed ordinary people. Now he was sitting in a British jail cell, wearing a standard-issue jumpsuit, being treated exactly like any other person who had committed assault. His lawyer, when he finally arrived, was the expensive London barrister named Reginald Thornberry, who specialized in representing wealthy Americans who found themselves in legal trouble abroad. Thornberry had dealt with cases involving drunk driving, tax evasion, and various forms of white-collar crime, but he had never had to defend someone for spitting on a Queen's Guard. "Well," Thornberry said after reviewing the evidence, "this is certainly unique. The good news is that assault by spitting typically carries a relatively light sentence, perhaps a fine and community service. The bad news is that the entire incident was filmed from multiple angles. There are dozens of witnesses, and the victim is a decorated war veteran who guards the Queen." "So what are you saying?" Victor asked. "I'm saying that you're going to plead guilty, pay whatever fine the court imposes, and hope this whole thing blows over quickly." But Victor's troubles were just beginning. Because while he sat in his cell contemplating his legal options, the internet was ensuring that this story would never blow over. The hashtag #OurSpitGate was trending worldwide, with millions of people sharing the videos and expressing their outrage at Victor's behavior. More importantly, James Mitchell had become an overnight hero. The image of him standing at attention with spit on his face, maintaining his dignity despite the humiliation, had touched something deep in the public consciousness. Here was a man who represented everything good about service, duty, and quiet heroism, contrasted against someone who represented everything wrong with unchecked privilege and entitlement. By the time Victor was released on bail the next morning, his life had already changed in ways he couldn't imagine. And James Mitchell's life was about to change too, though in far more positive ways. The real consequences of that moment of spit hitting a guard's face were only just beginning to unfold. 3 days after the incident, James Mitchell woke up in his small London flat to find his phone buzzing with notifications. Overnight, his story had spread far beyond the initial viral videos. News outlets from around the world were requesting interviews. Publishers wanted to discuss book deals. Movie producers were calling about film rights to his story. James sat on the edge of his bed, reading message after message, feeling overwhelmed by the sudden attention. He had joined the military to serve his country quietly, without fanfare or recognition. The idea of being famous made him deeply uncomfortable. A knock at his door interrupted his thoughts. When he opened it, he found his commanding officer, Colonel Robert Ashworth, standing in the hallway with a serious expression. "Good morning, Sergeant Mitchell," the colonel said. "I think we need to talk." James invited him in, offering tea while wondering if he was about to be disciplined for the media attention surrounding the incident. But Colonel Ashworth's first words surprised him. "First, I want you to know that the entire chain of command, right up to the top, is proud of how you handled that situation," the colonel said. "You maintained your dignity, followed protocol, and represented the Crown with honor under extremely difficult circumstances." "Thank you, sir," James replied, still uncertain where this conversation was heading. "However," the colonel continued, "we need to discuss what happens next. The media attention around this story isn't going to fade quickly. The public has latched onto you as a symbol of something larger than the incident itself. The palace is receiving hundreds of letters of support for you every day. The Prime Minister's office has called to commend your conduct." James frowned. "Sir, I just did my job. I don't understand why everyone's making such a big deal about it." Colonel Ashworth smiled. "That's exactly why they're making a big deal about it, son. In a world where people often seem to care only about themselves, you showed that there are still individuals who understand duty, respect, and quiet dignity. You've become a symbol of what's best about British values." The colonel pulled out a folder and placed it on the table between them. "Which brings us to some interesting developments. First, the palace has received a formal request from several veterans organizations to honor you for your service both in Afghanistan and in this incident. Second, you've been offered a promotion to Sergeant Major, effective immediately." James opened the folder and found letters from organizations he had only dreamed of being recognized by. The Royal British Legion wanted to give him their highest honor for exemplary service. A charity supporting wounded veterans had asked him to become their official spokesperson. 3 different universities had offered him honorary degrees. "Sir, this doesn't feel right," James said quietly. "All I did was stand still while someone spat on me. There are soldiers who've done far more than me who will never get this kind of recognition." "And that attitude," Colonel Ashworth said, "is exactly why you deserve it. But there's something else we need to discuss. Victor Pemberton's legal troubles are just beginning, and they extend far beyond spitting on you." Meanwhile, across London, Victor Pemberton was discovering that his moment of arrogance had unleashed consequences he never could have imagined. The viral videos had not only humiliated him publicly, but had also triggered investigations into his business practices that had been years in the making. The British tax authorities, having seen the extensive media coverage of a wealthy American bragging about his ability to buy Buckingham Palace, had decided to take a closer look at Victor's financial activities in the United Kingdom. What they found was a complex web of tax avoidance schemes that bordered on outright fraud. Victor's London lawyer, Reginald Thornberry, sat across from him in his expensive office, delivering news that grew worse with each sentence. "The assault charge is the least of your problems now," Thornberry said grimly. "The revenue investigation has uncovered what appears to be systematic tax evasion spanning the last 7 years. They're talking about criminal charges that could result in significant prison time." Victor's face had gone ashen. "But my accountants assured me everything we were doing was legal. These were legitimate tax strategies." "Perhaps in the United States," Thornberry replied, "but British tax law is quite different. And frankly, some of these schemes wouldn't pass muster in America either. The authorities are suggesting that your public boasting about your wealth, combined with the obvious discrepancies in your tax filings, constitutes evidence of deliberate fraud." But the legal troubles were only part of Victor's rapidly unfolding nightmare. The viral videos had also caught the attention of American authorities and media outlets who began their own investigations into the Pemberton family business empire. An investigative journalist named Rebecca Martinez at the Washington Post had spent years looking into corrupt real estate dealings in major American cities. The Pemberton case provided her with the perfect opportunity to shine a light on practices that had been hidden for decades. Rebecca's research revealed that Victor's real estate empire was built on a foundation of predatory lending practices, illegal evictions, and systematic harassment of low-income tenants. She found evidence of buildings deliberately allowed to fall into disrepair to force out rent-controlled tenants, of safety violations covered up by bribes to local officials, and of a pattern of targeting vulnerable communities for exploitation. The first article in what would become a Pulitzer Prize-winning series was published 1 week after the Buckingham Palace incident. Titled, "The Pemberton Files: How One Family's Greed Destroyed Communities," it detailed the systematic abuse of hundreds of families over 2 decades. Within hours of the article's publication, Victor's business empire began to collapse. Banks froze his credit lines pending investigation. Business partners scrambled to distance themselves from the Pemberton name. The stock price of his publicly traded company dropped by 60% in a single day. Victor's wife, Margaret, who had been quietly horrified by her husband's behavior for years, made a decision that shocked everyone who knew her. She filed for divorce and immediately moved out of their Manhattan penthouse with their daughter, Sarah. Sarah, meanwhile, was dealing with her own complex emotions about the situation. The teenager had grown up wealthy and privileged, but unlike her father, she had retained enough empathy to understand right from wrong. Watching the videos of the guard's dignified response to her father's humiliation had forced her to confront the reality of who Victor really was. In a post on her social media accounts that would be shared millions of times, Sarah wrote, "I am deeply ashamed of my father's actions at Buckingham Palace and the pain he has caused. The guard he attacked represents everything my father is not: honor, dignity, and service to others. I am cutting all ties with my father and will be working to make amends for the harm our family has caused." The post was accompanied by documentation showing that Sarah was donating her entire trust fund, worth over $10 million, to veterans' charities and organizations that helped victims of predatory landlords. Back in London, James Mitchell was struggling with his own unexpected situation. The attention had become so intense that he could barely leave his flat without being surrounded by reporters and well-wishers. The military had assigned him a public relations officer to help manage the media requests, but James found the whole experience overwhelming. His life changed dramatically when he received a personal letter from the Queen herself. The handwritten note, delivered by a palace courier, thanked him for his exemplary service and invited him to a private audience to discuss his future. The meeting took place in a small private room at Windsor Castle. James, wearing his dress uniform and feeling more nervous than he had during any combat mission, stood at attention as the Queen entered. "Please, Sergeant Mitchell, sit down," she said with a warm smile. "I wanted to thank you personally for the dignity you showed during that unfortunate incident. You represented not just the Guard, but the best qualities of our nation." "Your Majesty, I was just doing my duty," James replied, still somewhat overwhelmed by the situation. "Yes," she said, "you were. And that's what made your response so powerful. In an age when duty and honor are sometimes seen as old-fashioned concepts, you reminded the world why they remain important." The Queen then made an offer that would change James's life forever. She asked him to become a special ambassador for Veterans Affairs, a position that would allow him to travel the world, speaking about service, duty, and the importance of supporting those who had served their countries. "Your story has touched people far beyond Britain," she explained. "Veterans around the world see in you a reminder of why their service matters. I believe you could do enormous good in this role." James accepted, and within months found himself traveling internationally, speaking to governments about veterans support, visiting military hospitals, and helping to raise millions of dollars for service members and their families. His first major speaking engagement was at the United Nations, where he addressed an assembly on the importance of dignity and respect in human interactions. The speech, which was broadcast worldwide, became one of the most watched UN addresses in history. "A small act of disrespect," James told the assembly, "can have enormous consequences. But so can a small act of kindness, or dignity, or service. Each of us has the power to make the world slightly better or slightly worse with every interaction we have. The choice is always ours." Meanwhile, Victor Pemberton's legal troubles continued to mount. He was eventually convicted on multiple charges of tax evasion and fraud in both Britain and the United States. The man who had once boasted about buying Buckingham Palace was sentenced to 8 years in prison and ordered to pay over $50 million in fines and back taxes. But perhaps the most devastating consequence for Victor was not the legal punishment, but the complete destruction of his reputation and legacy. The Pemberton name, once synonymous with wealth and power, became a symbol of arrogance, greed, and the abuse of privilege. His real estate empire was broken up and sold, with much of the proceeds going to compensate the families who had been harmed by his predatory practices. The buildings he had allowed to fall into disrepair were renovated and converted into affordable housing for low-income families. Sarah Pemberton, who had legally changed her last name to her mother's maiden name, became a prominent advocate for housing reform and veterans' rights. She often spoke about how watching her father's behavior had taught her the importance of treating all people with dignity and respect. "My father thought his money made him superior to others," she said in one interview. "But that guard he humiliated taught me that true superiority comes from service, from putting others before yourself, from maintaining your dignity even when others try to take it away." 5 years after the incident, James Mitchell published a memoir titled Standing Guard: Lessons in Duty, Dignity, and Service. The book became an international bestseller, with all proceeds donated to veterans' charities. In the final chapter, James reflected on how one moment had changed so many lives. "When that man spat in my face, I could have responded with anger or violence. I could have abandoned my post, my duty, my training. But I remembered something my father told me when I was 8 years old, that nothing worth doing comes easy, and that true strength comes not from what you can do to others, but from what you choose not to do. I chose not to let one man's hatred diminish my service. I chose not to let his disrespect change who I am. And in making that choice, I learned that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply stand your ground and maintain your dignity. That moment taught me that respect isn't something that can be demanded or bought. It can only be earned through our actions, our choices, and our commitment to something greater than ourselves. And sometimes, the best revenge against someone who tries to humiliate you is simply to continue being the person you've always chosen to be." The book's dedication read, "To all who serve, and to the understanding that true nobility comes not from birth or wealth, but from the choice to put duty before self." Victor Pemberton died in prison 3 years into his sentence, largely forgotten, except as a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked privilege and arrogance. His obituary was less than 100 words long. James Mitchell continued his work as a veterans advocate for the rest of his life, eventually being knighted for his service to his country and to veterans worldwide. But he always said that his greatest honor was the 6 years he spent standing guard at Buckingham Palace, serving something greater than himself, with quiet dignity and unwavering dedication. The story became more than just a viral video or a news story. It became a reminder that in a world that often seems dominated by wealth, power, and privilege, there are still those who understand that true respect comes not from what you have, but from who you choose to be. And sometimes that choice is tested in the most unexpected ways, in the most public places, by people who think that money gives them the right to treat others as less than human. But as James Mitchell proved on that day at Buckingham Palace, dignity cannot be bought, respect cannot be demanded, and honor cannot be stolen. They can only be earned, one choice at a time.